left the Apostle Paul last time, we left him in quite a predicament. If you remember, he had left Caesarea on a ship headed for Rome as a prisoner to stand trial before Caesar on this accusation that he had somehow polluted the temple, the Jewish temple, by bringing Gentiles in there. And then there were all these trumped up charges about how he was teaching people to break the law and the Jewish law and all of these things. So he appeals to Caesar. They load him on a ship headed to Rome. And in the midst of this, as they leave the island of Crete, Paul says, we ought to stay right here. And they said, no, we're going to try to make it on to a little bit, just make it around to a better port. And so in the midst of that, they get caught in a terrible storm. And that where we last left Paul and the people on the ship, they were in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the ocean, being tossed about. They hadn't seen the sun or the stars in days. They haven't eaten anything. And, it's like one of those great cliffhangers. We leave them. We have to wait all week to find out, does Paul live or die, You kind of figure he lives since, he writes all these letters. But, let's pick up there and find out what happens on this exciting adventure that we're on with Paul. In addition to Paul being on the ship, there's several others. One we know of for sure that was on the ship with him was who? Luke, who is the author of Acts. So we're getting actually an eyewitness account here of what's taking place. Let's take a look. We're in verse 21 of Acts chapter 27. Acts 27:21. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me. So Paul pulls and I told you so here. You should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar. And indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Okay, so Paul he's in this storm just like everybody else is, and yet he's able to keep a positive attitude in the midst of this storm. How's he able to do that? So he knows it's from God, and God had revealed to him in this vision that he's going to survive. So you have an angel that shows up at night and says, don't worry, you're not going to die in this. You're going to appear before Caesar. Then that's about as good of authority as you're going to get. So he fully believed that this whole thing was from God, that God was directing the storm, and that God was also directing Paul. And in addition to Paul, he also God gave him the revelation that not only would Paul's life be saved, but all those who were on the ship would be saved. So, what did the angel mean when he said, God has granted you all those who sail with you? What did he mean by that? They're going to live too. It didn't mean everybody on the boat's going to get saved. That's not the idea there. But they're going to live. If they'll stay on the ship with you, then they're going to live too. As Christians, we're often, put in places of tragedy and situations of tragedy when the rest of the world might be, losing their head. As Christians, then we have an opportunity to be encouraging. How can we do that? Yes, encouraging to other people in the midst of tragedy as Christians. Sure. Right. Yeah. You know, we one of the best opportunities I think that we've had recently is through the whole COVID thing, and the world was terrified, and we as Christians had the opportunity to say, "Look, we trust the Lord, and we choose to live by faith rather than by fear." And we're not going to be stupid about it, but we're going to live our life and trust God with the outcome. And I think sadly, I mean, a lot of times some of the most terrified people I saw were Christians, which I think, um, you know, might not have helped the testimony much. But I think that's just one way. I mean, there's all kinds. I mean, you know, gosh, I've pastored through a lot of tragedy. 9/11. The church houses were full for a little while because why? Fear is a motivator. It's not a good motivator. It doesn't last long. Love is a much better motivator than fear, but fear is a motivator. Church houses were full, and we had an opportunity to say, "Hey, God's got this." So we do have an opportunity to demonstrate faith and encouragement in times of tragedy, and that's what Paul is doing here. Questions on those verses? Who has your ear? Yeah, I mean, who are you listening to? Yeah, right. Well, if you really believe that God knows everything and that God is all powerful and that God loves you infinitely, then what really do we have to worry about? If you stop and think about it, there's not anything that's happening to you or to me that God doesn't know about, that God can't take care of, and He will always do what is the very best for you. Not just what's okay, but He will always, because He loves us, and His love is perfect, He will always do for us what is the best and perfect thing. So if you look at it like that, what really do I have to worry about? I mean, yeah, that's true. Faith and fear can't coexist. Where fear is present, faith is absent. And faith dispels fear. And one of Paul's letters, he says, perfect love casts out fear. Because fear involves punishment, but we serve God who has already punished our sins on the cross. So, anyway, I'm not going to jump off into a sermon, although I could very easily here, but we can be an encouragement for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. Yeah, I mean So I think sometimes we're praying about things that God's already told us to do. I mean, um, if you see somebody that needs to know Jesus, you don't have to sit and pray about whether you should go witness to them. Just go do it. Just go get it. Anyway, all right. Let's look on then, verse 27. Now, when the 14th night had come, so 2 weeks they've been at this now. As we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. So what's that telling you? Getting closer to land, which is not necessarily a good thing if you're not in control of the ship. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Why would they want day to come? So they could see where they were and where they were going. As the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. So in other words, what are they trying to do? They're trying to escape, but they're acting like, oh, we're going to put out the lifeboats to rescue everybody, but they're actually going to try to take off by themselves. Paul said, verse 31, to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as the day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day. You have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. When he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. Notice we get the we there to tell us Luke is part of that group. When they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. Okay, so through it all, Paul demonstrates faith. How did he demonstrate faith through this ordeal? What does he do? Yeah. So what? They're all they fasted for 14 days. They haven't eaten anything. What's Paul doing? I'm having a snack, man. And he says, eat. It's good for you. Eat because you're going to be safe. If you stay on the ship, you're going to be safe. And he says to them in verse 25, take heart. He's encouraging them. He's the prisoner, right? He's not the soldier in charge. He's not the captain of the boat. He's not the chaplain on the ship. He's just a prisoner, but he's encouraging them. There's this sermon illustration, and it's like 100 years old. It's in one of these books of sermon illustrations where, this guy was in, a storm, and he comes, passenger, and he comes back and he says, it's going to be all right, folks. I've seen the captain of the ship, and he's smiling, and that's, supposed to be, trust God and all of that. Well, here's the thing. Paul could see the captain of the ship, but he wasn't smiling. I mean, he was scared to death. I'm talking about the earthly captain of the ship. He's scared. Everybody is scared. Paul's just sitting back having a snack, telling him, calm down. Everything's going to be all right. God's going to take care of us. So they hadn't eaten for 14 days. Why? Well, it could be. They could have been seasick. The storm was horrible, so they could have been sick. They could have also been what? Scared. When you're terrified, some people do. Some people eat when they're afraid. I mean, there are some people that don't. So like Lisa and I are completely different when it comes to fear. Like if we're afraid, if she's afraid or I'm afraid or stressed about something, she copes with it by eating. The last thing in the world I want to do is eat. She can go to sleep and just sleep her stress away. Me, I'm not going to sleep for a week. I mean, I'm up. I mean, and the Lord's had many talkings to me about that before. Like, you're supposed to trust me. I do trust you, Lord. Then why don't you go to sleep then? It just doesn't, So we deal with stress in this different ways, but it could very well be that they were terrified. The other option could be what? Well, but Paul found something to eat. So the other option could have been that they were doing what? Fasting and praying. Obviously not to the one true God, you would think, but to whatever God they worshiped, that they were trying to, let's pull out all the stops and pray and fast and hope for the best kind of thing. So how was Paul able to use this tragedy? Now, we've seen Paul throughout the whole book of Acts use every opportunity to share the gospel and to witness. How does he use this situation for that? What does he do? Do what? Yeah, he shows his faith, and he says, well, you don't have to be afraid. Why? Yeah, God's taking care of it. He gives me a vision. that we're all going to be okay. And then from that spins into, talking about the one true God. So he uses every opportunity to share his faith. Questions or comments on those verses? Yeah, stay. Yeah, they've learned their lesson. Yeah, Paul's making some headway here. That's right. That's right. Yeah. They've started to figure out maybe this Paul guy, maybe we need to listen to him after all. All right, let's look on to verse 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land. In other words, they didn't know where they were. But they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. In other words, cut loose the anchors. We really don't have a lot of way of steering it, but we'll just cut loose the anchors, throw up the sail, and hopefully we'll run into the shore of this bay, this island. And even though we don't know where we are, being on land should be better and safer than being lost at sea. But striking a place where the two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to the land. And the rest, some on board, some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So they see the daylight comes. They see a shore in the distance. They say, okay, we don't know where we are, but any land is better than where we are stuck in the sea. So cut the ropes to the anchors, throw up the sail. We're going to try to run the ship on ground, and we will be safe on land. The idea of some of the soldiers was, let's kill the prisoners. Let's just kill them and get it over with. Why? Why would they want to do that? And what would happen if they escaped? Yeah, see, the soldiers are responsible for them. So how it worked in the Roman system was, if you're a soldier in charge of a prisoner, your life, it's your life for theirs. If that prisoner escapes, then you pay the price. So if that prisoner was sentenced to death, then you must die in his place. That's the idea. So they think, let's just kill him, and that way we won't have to worry about him escaping. But the centurion stops him. Why? He wants to save Paul. Why? Well, he's got to go to Caesar, but he likes Paul. What's Paul been doing this whole trip? He's been talking. He's been witnessing. Could it be, and we're not told that, but could it be that maybe this centurion is started to believe this gospel that Paul has been preaching? And whether he's a full-fledged believer or at least under conviction, he does. If a man is talking to you about forgiveness of sin and eternal life, the last thing you want to do is kill the messenger before you hear how. If somebody says, I know the way that you can live forever in the most glorious place you could ever imagine, the last thing you want to do is see that person killed until you can get the story from them. So he wants to save Paul, and he does. How do you see God's hand at work through all of this whole event? Do what? So he wants Paul to get to Rome, and so what do we see from God? Sure. Sure. So God is Paul is testifying of what God is doing through the whole thing. How do we see God's hand? Well, the storm, for one thing. Yeah, it was a time for storm, and it was an area for storm, but this storm seems to be somehow supernaturally guided. So the storm, the vision that Paul gets, certainly is from God. The shipwreck itself, by all odds, these whole men all of this crew should have been dead. I mean, their boat runs aground, but before they can get to shore, the ship is being torn apart in the waves. Some of them don't know how to swim. They're having to try to paddle the shore on boards and all kinds of stuff. I mean, that all of them would survive. How is that possible if not for God? So God's hand is all on this. In the midst of the tragedy, in the midst of the storm, God's hand is all over this. When we lived in Southeast Texas, I lived through 2 hurricanes. And I tell people I don't wish that on anybody, but I sure don't want to have to do another one myself. It's a horrible, horrible thing, but through it all, God's hand was all over it. I mean, I could just sit here and talk for hours about how God worked through all of that. So Paul so we see God's hand at work in this. What at first seems like tragedy, sometimes in reality is a blessing. How do you see that true in this case? How is this whole thing a blessing? Yeah, certainly it provides a great witnessing opportunity for Paul. Also, Paul is going to get to appear before Caesar, and he's going to do it at Caesar's expense. Now, that's how God works. God's not only going to give you the chance to witness to Caesar, but he's going to make Caesar pay for it. So that's how that's going to work. Has it ever been true in your life where what at first seemed like tragedy ended up being a blessing? Anybody have one that comes to mind that you would like to share? Okay. Okay. Yeah. And here we are. Here's your godly friends. Yeah. 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 I still remember laying in bed, Lisa and I crying, saying, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" Because it seemed for sure we weren't going to be able to stay where we were, and we didn't have anywhere else to go. And finally, I said, "Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to trust God, and He is going to prove Himself faithful, as He always does, and we will have the testimony to tell our grandkids one day." And sure enough, God proved Himself faithful, and had that not have happened, we wouldn't be in Oklahoma right now. We wouldn't be in Claremore right now. We would never met y'all. And the situation that we're in here is 100 times better than the situation we were in there. I just don't have no grandkids yet to tell the story about. But one of these days, one of these days, man. But anyway, so take heart. If you are experiencing tragedy now, or do so in the near future, and everybody does, don't get any illusions that some people go through life with never experiencing tragedy. Everybody has their series of good times Everybody has their series of hard times. It's part of this thing called life that we do. But I might say, in the midst of tragedy, look for the blessing there. You'll find it. You might have to look a little bit and trust a little bit, but oftentimes I've found that what at first seems like tragedy can end up being a blessing in the end. Questions on Acts 27? All right, so Malta is where he is. And just so happens that our own Cassidy Harper just wrapped up a long mission trip there. And I've got a few pictures from her. These are Cassidy's pictures. This is St. John's Bay. There's two ideas of where Paul may have landed. One was St. Paul's Bay, and one was St. John's Bay. Our friend Dave Stott is going to kind of talk a little bit about that in the video, and he's going to say probably St. Paul's Bay. So why am I putting St. John's Bay up here? Because that's the pictures that Cassidy gave me. All right, I don't have pictures of St. Paul's Bay. This is St. John's Bay. But the neat thing about St. John's Bay is they found some old anchors, ship anchors from Roman times in St. John's Bay. So could be, who knows? So you see this another picture of the same area. Do we have one more? There we go. This, and you know, from the pictures, I thought I'm going to show them this picture, and your first thought is, I'm going to go to Malta because it's beautiful. And really, our old projector and screen don't really do it justice. But I mean, the pictures that she gave me when I put them on my computer, they just pop. I mean, they're just, it's the most beautiful. And that water, you can't really tell it with that on that screen, but it's like the most beautiful turquoise, clear water you've ever seen. So I'm thinking, yeah, Malta on the bucket list. That's definitely a good one. All right, well, we got about I don't remember, 6-minute video or something where Brother Dave talks about what we've talked about tonight.
According to Acts, the fearful crew lowered their sails and dropped a sea anchor into the water to slow their movement towards Syrtis. A sea anchor is like a big parachute in the water to stabilize a ship in the waves and currents. And then the sailors began to throw cargo and equipment overboard to lighten the load. Day after day, the wind and the waves pounded against the ship, weakening the timbers and soaking the passengers. Everyone on board was cold, sick, hungry, and afraid.
Luke wrote, "When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved." Acts 27:20.
For 2 weeks, they were adrift, being driven by the winds, expecting the end with every wave. But the vessel held together, and they were no longer being driven toward the Syrtis sands off Libya. Here's what happened next, according to Luke's dramatic first-person account.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight, the sailors sensed they